In my presentation, I shall touch upon two aspects of the relationship between Europe and the Caucasus region. As for the first one, the first chapter, and that I would say that right away that just as other speakers have said, I perceive the Caucasus as being part of Europe. Therefore, successes and failures, challenges and threats that we have experienced or are experiencing in other parts of Europe should be construed here too as a complex heritage that we all share throughout this continent, as a common source of inspiration for this region of Europe too. Coming from a Central European country, I feel even more inclined to stress and to underline this linkage, since the great geopolitical changes that took place more than 20 years ago, and which, like a powerful earthquake, have radically altered the world landscape, have had a dramatic impact both on the region where my country is located and on the Caucasus. Today we are obviously wiser and more knowledgeable than we were at the beginning of that historic process. And the lessons learned, the conclusions drawn from the events of the last 2 decades are more than relevant not only for us from the Baltics to the Mediterranean, but also for our neighbors in this part of Europe where we happen to be today. I'm not going to dwell on the undeniable achievements of wide-scale fundamental domestic reforms that were introduced in our societies in Central Europe, in the political, legal, economic, and other fields. And I'm saying all this fully aware of the objective difficulties, the subjective misjudgments, foreseeable or unexpected challenges that have accompanied our march on this dumpy road leading to a free and democratic societies. Let us make no mistake, even in the shadow of the global financial and economic crisis, with people's expectations frustrated and Euroscepticism growing, one has to state as often as necessary, and this is what I'm doing here, that what has been unfolding before our eyes since the early 50s, when the founding fathers of the European integration had laid the pillars of a unique undertaking, this will figure prominently in the history books of future generations. What do I mean in more concrete terms? I mean the notion that acting together, we can make a difference. An honest look, without complacency at one's own history, reconciliation with neighbors, and opening a new chapter in bilateral relations that involves not only the highest echelons of power, but also civil societies and young people. Then building regional cooperation in various fields that includes cross-border projects of all sorts. An appropriate educational program for the new generation. All these steps did help and continue to help create a new atmosphere and to offer a new, hitherto unknown quality to the continent in a stark contrast with the early decades of the 20th century. Even it has been highlighted quite often, it's still worth reminding ourselves that the process leading to this state of affairs came as a result of relentless efforts, and it is a guarantee for avoiding wars, violent conflicts, among others, among the countries members of the European Union. It is an assurance for creating social peace within each country, and hence for opening promising prospects for further economic development in our pluralistic societies, which of course is not to say that within the EU there can be no divergences of views, no problems to settle, no tensions to ease. And I'm not going to speak either of the complexities of the EU structures and mechanisms, and of the obvious difficulties, I'd like to underline this, the obvious difficulties of the permanent adjustment of these structures, of these mechanisms to the constantly changing environment. This unprecedented undertaking to create a community of values on an extremely diversified continent, as we all know, where you will find an abundance of dramatic historic experiences, different languages, religions, cultures, mentalities, etc., where setting up and most importantly, constantly renewing the appropriate frameworks for an ever-deepening economic and political integration, I underline the word political integration, is rightly easier said than done. But history cannot and should not be measured by intervals of a couple of years. I believe that by its mere existence, the European Union is accomplishing a historic mission by going over national boundaries, and by searching for common answers to the many regional and global problems that beset us today. There are a good number of areas where we can be rightly proud of our record, and there are domains where there is a pressing need to go further and work relentlessly for a higher quality in our common endeavors. Judging by the nature of what we are doing in the European Union, no one should be surprised by the difficulties encountered. They are there to be overcome, but to visualize the decline of European integration is a far cry from realities. And as I said before, I consider the Caucasus to be part of the European continent, and in my view, the peoples who live in this region and their governments ought to watch closely the developments on the other side of the Black Sea. They can draw useful conclusions from or avoid mistakes in actions undertaken by EU members. All this for the sake of a smoother transition towards a more peaceful and more livable future. Just as the European Union will understand, European Union for its part is vitally interested in the stability of this neighborhood. In our world, it's self-evident that the EU's security begins outside its borders. A prominent channel through which it hopes to get closer to this objective is, as we heard, its Eastern Partnership Program, a roadmap for deeper engagement with the EU. The future of our continent, the place Europe will take on the world scene in the next decades will be greatly determined by the way the European Union will perform, going beyond the various national interests, and cementing them into one cohesive direction. For many reasons, I do not think that this prospect should leave anyone interested in normalcy, democracy, transparency, effective good governance, should leave no one interested in all these things indifferent from the Black to the Caspian Sea. Obviously, all the interested parties in this region of our continent are and will be guided in this respect by their own specific conditions, by their own interests and preferences. And speaking about our host country, I clearly see here a highly relevant, rather particular role for it, stemming from its place on the confines of Europe with Asia across its borders. As for the other aspect of the relationship between the Caucasian region and the rest of Europe, I have bad news for all of us. In fact, towards the end of the bloodiest of all centuries, the 20th, we have witnessed something that I would have never thought possible after all the wars, massacres, and destructions that took place during the period of 100 years in Europe. The heartbreaking drama of the peoples of former Yugoslavia, who lived through in the 1990s this drama, had suddenly become a brutal reminder of a sour reality. The roots of our European civilization are not as solid, they are not as deep as we all thought they were. As a result of the reappearance in that country, which was about to fall apart in the Western Balkans, of phantoms of the past, hate, ultranationalism, racism, exclusion, intolerance, xenophobia have gained the upper hand and have poisoned people's minds to the point of turning them into Frankensteins and pushing them into acts of ethnic cleansing, of blind ethnocentric genocide. The mere fact that such savagery could have recently taken place in the heart of Europe should make us think twice about where we stand today. Quite rightly, former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan had characterized what happened in that land I spoke about by the words, "Evil exists." Yes, unfortunately, no one can sit back and relax at the sight of what happened and what is happening in our world today, including in certain regions of the European continent. Because I'm not talking only about recent violent conflicts that have tortured or are making normalcy impossible as we speak in certain parts of our European neighborhood. I'm also talking about their impact on today, about the horrific consequences they carry on ordinary people's behavior. As we have seen, hate can lead to atrocious acts portrayed as vengeance, which make it even more difficult to re-establish reasonable people-to-people relations. And I'm also talking about what we see today, nowadays, in our own courtyard. The spread of an ultra-radical rhetoric, the surge of easy, cheap, attractive populist ideas, of an ethnocentric vision of the world, which do exploit, unfortunately, the vulnerability of the ordinary person. Unfortunately, such phenomena have raised their ugly heads recently in various countries of the old continent through manifestations of intolerance, criminal activities, racially motivated killings perpetrated against Roma citizens, or appeals in a parliament to draw up a list of members of government and parliament of Jewish origin, allegedly representing a national security risk.
Mr. Ambassador, you have 2 minutes.
Yes, we are still vulnerable. We have to keep our eyes open and relentlessly remind people, especially the younger generations, where we come from, what past, what horrors we left behind, what legacy we are carrying. The present worrisome situation is another wake-up call after so many. The awareness of the lessons of a rather turbulent past in Europe, a sober and rational analysis of history should help us combat these siren songs which would take us back to earlier dark times. And as we saw, the danger always starts with words, with verbal constructions, and only later do they turn into physical acts. Therefore, a permanent vigilance can and must be our guide. Nationalistic emotions so easily incited against minorities, against neighbors, against anyone different can turn at some point into ethnic violence and dramatically ruin the prospects of peaceful coexistence in a multicultural society in an ethnically diverse region. Take the example of Bosnia, the country that even today cannot get out of the psychological trauma that all the peoples who live in that country suffered some 20 years ago. So I think, in conclusion, that what is needed here on the part of all sides is a critical assessment of realities, political courage, innovative thinking, readiness to compromise, a firm refusal of destructive ideas, and the necessary political will to carry out this refusal, the adherence to core values of our civilization, respect for human rights and minority rights, and, in conclusion, the last part of the sentence, and the recognition that the notion of territorial integrity, coupled with special arrangements reflecting local conditions, should not be construed as an obsolete idea.